Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or hello if you are new. In today's true crime video we will be diving into the case of the Gonzales family murders, which is actually a requested case from one of you guys on my previous videos, so thank you so much for the suggestion. The person that did suggest this case, their name is in the description box below, so again thank you so much. Before we do get into the video, I just want to say, as I always do, I am in no way a professional. I do not work in any areas of crime investigation or law. I just simply like to review and learn about different crime cases from all over the world, so all this information is from online sources that are available to you guys and the general public. No disrespect is ever intended towards anyone I may mention in this video or any of my other videos, so with that being said, let's just dive on right into the case. Also, just quickly, I had some people DM me on my Instagram, which thank you so much for finding me on Instagram. My Instagram handle, I'll just insert it here, and it's also always in the description box below. But I had some people DM me asking me where I got my jewelry from, and they've also asked me where I've gotten some of my tops from in my other videos. So this top is actually just from Zara. My necklace is from By Charlotte, and my rings are usually just from Swarovski. And my earrings are from Frankie Say Relax. Just in case any of you wanted to know, because I do sometimes get DMs on my Instagram now, which is so cool, so thank you so much. So in 2004, a vacant house had gone up for sale in the suburb of North Ryde, Sydney, Australia. The property had actually been up on the market for around 3 years or so, and no one was interested in it, no one was buying it, so every now and then the real estate agency would just lower and lower the price gradually, hoping to hook in a buyer. Finally, this worked and a family came forward. Their name was the Lin family, and they were Taiwanese immigrants, and they were looking for something in North Ryde, and this just seemed absolutely perfect for them. They had gone through the property multiple times, and each time they just fell in love with it more and more. They just knew that this house was perfect for them, so they put in an offer, and the offer was actually accepted at a very good price. Like, it was a bargain for North Ryde, Sydney. So news started to spread locally when the Lin family's offer got accepted on this house, because, you know, there was a big sold sticker now out on the board out the front of the house, and people knew that this house had been up for sale for so long, and the people in the area actually knew about this house. The people in the town thought it was a little bit of a weird, very controversial purchase, and eventually newspapers started writing articles in the local paper about the Lin's purchase. The Lins ultimately came across one of these articles that had been written about them and their new purchase in the paper, and they were horrified when they learnt of the events that once took place in their home. The history of this house was never brought up with the Lins. The real estate agency never said anything, and ultimately the Lin family felt quite deceived. It actually bothered them so much that they demanded to be released from this property purchase and the contract, because they didn't want it anymore. They couldn't live in it knowing its dark history, and they were lawfully released from the contract and didn't end up purchasing the property. So the real estate agency in turn got in a lot of trouble for not disclosing the history of the property to these buyers, but ultimately it wasn't sold yet, so it went back up for sale in 2005. Now, instead of it just saying for sale on the for sale sign at the front of the house, it actually had some additional fine print at the bottom that read, "This is the former home of the Gonzales family." So now we're going to flashback to the very beginning, and I will give a brief overview of who the Gonzales family was before we dive into the events of this case. So the Gonzales family consisted of 4 members: Teddy Gonzales, who was the father, his wife Loiva Gonzales, and their 2 children, their son Seth Gonzales, who was the eldest, and their daughter Claudine Gonzales. Teddy worked really hard to give his family a good life. He did not want to struggle financially like his family did when they were growing up. He wanted to be able to provide, you know, his children lots of opportunities in life so they could, you know, excel and have the best possible future. Teddy had a really good work ethic. He was really determined academically. He did really well with his studies, and that was proven when he passed the bar exam. So from there he could practice as a lawyer. The family was actually from Baguio in the Philippines. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong or if my accent stuffed it up. In 1989, Teddy actually built a hotel in the Philippines. It was like a 40-room hotel. It had a restaurant and a bar, and this was a really, really great achievement for him and his wife, Loiva. They actually lived in the hotel as well, so this was not just, you know, a business opportunity and an investment. It was a home as well, so they took a lot of pride in this hotel. In 1990, unfortunately, a devastating earthquake hit the town of Baguio in the Philippines, and it claimed many, many lives, and it did also hit the Gonzales' hotel. When they were fleeing, they actually realized that their son Seth was not with them, and they realized that he was actually trapped in the hotel. They thought they had all gotten out. So Teddy Gonzales, Seth's father, ran back to the hotel and ran into the debris to save his son. Fortunately, Teddy did find his son Seth alive, and he was fine. He saved him from the rubble, but unfortunately their home had collapsed. So because this earthquake had destroyed their business and their home, they decided to try and find somewhere to relocate that wouldn't have another natural disaster, just somewhere more safe. A lot of their family members had actually relocated over to Australia, and they had been there multiple times, I believe, to visit their families, and Loiva in particular really loves Sydney, so they decided that they were going to move to Australia. Sydney seemed like a really, really good place to raise their children, and it just seemed perfect for them. So they ended up packing up and leaving for Sydney, and they were really excited. Teddy ended up getting some more qualifications so he could practice law in Australia, and when they got there, he actually ended up opening his own firm, which was Teddy Gonzales and Associates, and in this firm, he was especially interested in helping other Filipino immigrants get their documents prepared to come over to Australia just like he had done. His wife Loiva worked as an admin at the firm, so they were a really great team. She took care of the admin stuff. He was working as a lawyer, so yeah, they both just were a really good team, and they got to work together every day. In 1999, the business was just absolutely thriving. The family was thriving. They were really, really successful, so they ended up buying a block of land in North Ryde, Sydney, and they were going to build their dream home that would comfortably fit all four of them. Seth and Claudine had a pretty good upbringing in Australia. I mean, their parents were quite successful, so the kids had lots of opportunities growing up, which, as I mentioned earlier, was exactly what their father Teddy had worked so hard to do. Teddy and Loiva were pretty strict with the kids in terms of academics and obedience, but they meant well and they loved their children very much. They were hoping that one day Seth would follow in his father's footsteps and practice law, but they also maybe hoped that he would work in medicine or become a doctor or something like that. Seth actually attended Parramatta High School, and once he graduated from there, he went on to university to just study a science degree. Seth's passion was actually not law or medicine, but it was actually music. He was apparently quite a good singer. Seth had actually joined a boy band called Definite Vibes, and they would play at nightclubs and host parties, and the band was okay. Apparently it was met with sort of mixed feelings and reviews, but apparently their parties were really, really good. From his work in the band, Seth actually was offered a recording contract from a music company, and this in turn actually made him have a lot of fans, so his dating life was just going up. He had one obsessive fan in particular called Daisy Diaz, and she ran a website that was basically all about Seth. It was called Daisy's Dedication to Seppi. My god, like when I said that, I just cringed. The website was just, as I said, like a dedication to Seth, so it was just filled with cheesy like song lyrics that she'd written about him and quotes and photos of him, and it was just like a fangirl page. It was dedication to Seppi. Hardcore fan account. So as you can probably guess, did Teddy and Loiva approve of Seth's music band pathway? No. Obviously, Teddy and Loiva were very, very academic and very, very career driven. So they sort of saw music as a side hobby for Seth, not a career. Seth was also quite successful, according to his friends, in kickboxing, personal training, and modeling, but everyone also knew him for being academic. So while Seth was at university, he ended up getting into a medical degree of some sort, but he quickly realized that it just wasn't for him, so he stopped. He then decided to go down the law pathway like his father, and obviously his parents were actually quite ecstatic about that. So at this point, he was 20 years old and he had just finished his end of semester at uni, and his results in his law course were showing that he was excelling a lot. He was exceeding expectations, and obviously this made Teddy and Loiva very, very proud. He also was working part-time at his father's law firm, and he just provided like paralegal assistance around the office, and it was good for him because it would allow him to get his foot in the door and really see what it was all about, you know, in the flesh. So because Seth's parents were just so proud of him and all his efforts in his uni, studying law, working in the law firm, they actually ended up buying him a car, which was a green Ford Festiva, and Seth, like, it was his pride and joy. He absolutely loved that car. Claudine was also very good at her studies, but she was way more out there personality-wise compared to her brother Seth. Seth was considered quite relaxed and reserved. Claudine was sporty, she did really well in athletics, and her dream one day was to become a teacher. Claudine was struggling a little bit with trying to live up to her parents' expectations, but this was on a different matter. Claudine actually had a boyfriend, and when she told her parents about this and they met him, they just didn't really approve. They thought that he was a bad influence on Claudine. They wanted her to stick to her studies and really stay focused just in these younger years. And obviously Claudine rebelled a little bit. She would sneak out to see him since her parents didn't approve and didn't let her go see him herself. And Teddy and Loiva were really getting fed up with this. They didn't want this boy to take Claudine away and take her off the rails. They feared that Claudine's social life was just going to interfere completely with her academic life at school, which was a big no-no for Teddy and Loiva. So they actually ended up sending her all the way down to Melbourne to go live with a relative so she could finish her last year of school and complete her studies without any distractions, which, I don't know, I just feel like that's a little bit extreme. Claudine actually continued a long distance relationship with this boy. I don't know how her parents knew about it, but they did, and obviously they weren't happy that Claudine was still in contact with him. So Seth actually got involved and contacted the guy saying to leave his sister Claudine alone because he was in a criminal gang and his gang would do something to him if he didn't leave her alone. Seth obviously was not in a gang. That was just a lie. But it did end up making the boy leave Claudine alone, so they were no longer an item. So flashing forward slightly to July 2001, it was a typical day for the Gonzales family. Teddy and Loiva had gone to work at the law firm. Seth had gone to university in the morning, and Claudine actually stayed at home because she was studying. She was due to return to Melbourne in a couple of days, so she was just studying at home. So later in the day, Loiva's sister, Emily Luna, was actually in the neighborhood or somewhere nearby going to pick up her 8-year-old son from school or daycare or something like that. She thought because she was close by, she would stop in at the Gonzales family home and say hi, have a chat to her sister, and just check in. So when Emily pulled up to the Gonzales home, she was a little surprised because it appeared that no one was home. Everything looked really dark inside. There was no lights coming from the windows. Just everything was really silent and quiet and dark. And this was weird because she knew her sister Loiva was typically home from work by 6 p.m. on weeknights. Seth's green Ford Festiva was parked in the driveway, but it didn't appear like he was home. As I said, she didn't think anyone was home. It was eerily silent. She then saw someone or something swiftly just walk by one of the windows, like a figure in the shadows. So she thought, oh, okay, maybe one person's home at least. It was a really, really wet day in Sydney that day. It had been raining for majority of the day, and Emily recalls her being thankful that it had stopped raining just for that moment for her and her son to get out of the car and walk to the Gonzales' front door without needing their umbrella. So Emily and her son stood at the front door ringing the bell and knocking multiple times, and they could see a faint light coming from what looked like the back of the house, but no one was answering the door at all. The Gonzaleses actually had 6 little dogs that were said to have always barked when someone rang the doorbell or knocked or came through the front door, but there was no noise, no barking or anything. When Emily peered through the front door window, she was immediately startled to see a figure, like a dark figure, standing upright just opposite her, looking out at her from inside. And can I just say, when I was researching this case and was reading about this part with the figure looking back, it actually gave me chills all over, because isn't that just some people's worst nightmare? Like, you know, it's already scary around you if you're in a situation, and then you peer through something and you're hoping that there's nothing like there that's going to scare you. That's like just like this. I don't know if anyone else feels like that, but it scares me. The figure was wearing a long coat and a cap, and Emily was sure that it was a male figure because she thought that she saw it move slightly, but she wasn't 100% sure. Her 8-year-old son also saw this figure in the darkness through the window, but he dismissed it, saying that it was just a coat stand with a long coat and a hat on top of it, and it just looked like a male figure in the darkness. Emily wasn't so sure about this, so she walked past the front door and towards the back of the house around the side, but she only got as far as the carport when she just had a really unsettling feeling that she shouldn't go any further, so she didn't. She figured she'd just call her sister later, so her and her son got back in their car and they drove away from the Gonzales house. So once Emily arrived home, she called her sister Loiva and she called the Gonzales family house phone over and over again, but it just wouldn't connect. It would just say line busy. So at around 8:45 p.m. that night, Seth and one of his best mates, Sam, were actually out having dinner at the Planet Hollywood restaurant. Seth was not really in the mood to eat out at this restaurant. He was sort of picking at his food and he was worried about eating it because he was telling his mate Sam how his mother had actually come down with food poisoning from eating out either at this restaurant or just a similar restaurant that serves similar food. During this dinner, Sam actually received a phone call from his own sister, and his sister was friends with Claudine, who was Seth's sister. Sam's sister Michelle was actually calling to see if either Sam or Seth could get in contact with Claudine, because she had been trying to call and leave messages all night, but Claudine just wasn't responding. Neither Sam or Seth was able to make contact with Claudine either, so Michelle just left it. After dinner, Seth and Sam actually just went next door to the Galaxy World arcade and they just hung out there, talked with each other, played video games all night until 11 p.m. Seth drove Sam home in his own car and then he proceeded to go to his own home where he was going to call it for the night. Later that night at around 11:48 p.m, a frantic 000 phone call came through requesting an ambulance to a property on Collins Street in North Ryde. The caller was 20-year-old Seth Gonzales and he was explaining frantically to the operator that his family had been shot and were bleeding out in their family home. A neighbor actually awoke to hear thumping noises and just really, really loud noises like knocking on the side of his house, and when he went out he realized that it was also 20-year-old Seth Gonzales asking and pleading him for help because his family had been killed. The neighbors across the street could hear all this commotion, so they came running out as well, and they saw Seth just pacing up and down on his property, and he was just saying that his family had gone. He was in hysterics, pacing, he didn't know what to do. Seth then collapsed in a heap, just in hysterics, and then he suddenly got up after a while and raced inside, claiming he knew how to do CPR. Teddy Gonzales was laying on his back and he was just laying in a pool of his own blood. There was blood everywhere and he had a huge wound in his chest. Teddy was clearly unresponsive, but Seth was just frantically trying to do whatever he could to revive his father, but a neighbor came in and tried to grab Seth and pick him up, put him outside, and told him to just wait for the authorities to get there. The neighbors couldn't really hold Seth, and he ended up running back into the home, where he found his mother lying in the living room next to a glass coffee table, and she was also clearly unresponsive. She had wounds all over her, including a very, very large wound to her neck. The neighbors were trying to get Seth out because they didn't know if the intruder or attacker who'd done this to Seth's mother and father was still in the house. They could have been upstairs. So they coaxed Seth to go outside to safety until the authorities got there to search the house to make sure the intruder was not there anymore. Authorities finally arrived to the scene, and once they confirmed that there was no intruder in the house anymore, they led a medic in to tend to Teddy, Loiva, and Claudine Gonzales. Claudine was actually found in her bedroom, and she was laying in a fetal position on the floor, and there was actually a red jumper covering her wounds that were sustained during her vicious attack. Now, none of the victims had actually been shot like Seth originally had said on the 000 phone call to authorities and to his neighbors. Teddy and Loiva had actually been savagely stabbed multiple times, and Seth had obviously just misjudged these for gunshot wounds just because there was multiple wounds all over them and there was so much blood. Teddy predominantly had wounds in his chest and his upper body, while Loiva actually had different stab wounds in different areas, but more so to her torso and her neck. Both of them also had clear defensive wounds on them, so they put up a fight before they were killed. Claudine, however, appeared to be bludgeoned to death. There was a large wound on her head that had clearly been made by a heavy kind of object. Her skull had actually been fractured, and there were clear like dent marks on the wall behind her. So these were actually shaped in a shape of a baseball bat, as if you've like hit a baseball bat against the wall and it's made a dent. Claudine had also been strangled, and she had been stabbed, as there were just wounds all over her body. Investigators established times of death that they presume the victims died at. They think that Claudine died first because she was not answering text messages or phone calls from people. Investigators think that she approximately died at some point just after 4 p.m. that day, and she actually had open textbooks on her desk, so authorities assume that she was just studying and she was ambushed from behind and had no idea that she was going to be attacked. At around 4:50 p.m. that day, Loiva Gonzales left work with a colleague and shortly after returned home. It would have been at around this time, as soon as she walked into the living area, the killer would have come through and attacked her and killed her, and this is where she was ultimately found. Phone records show that Teddy Gonzales actually left work at around 6:20 p.m. and he actually made some phone calls to the family home, but they all went unanswered. As we know, everyone would have been dead already inside. It's thought that Teddy was struck as soon as he walked through the door, because that is where he was found. So now authorities had to interview Seth Gonzales because he was the only person remaining out of the Gonzales family. Seth was retracing the events of the night and was saying that he found his family members like this upon arriving at the house after he'd been out with a friend for dinner and majority of the night. Seth said that he recalled seeing two perpetrators running south down Collins Street from the vicinity of his home. He attempted to chase them down, however he gave up and he ended up running back to his family home and calling the authorities, tending to his parents, and calling the neighbors for help. Seth did not know anyone that would want to do this to his family. However, he did recall an event that had happened just the previous night. It was a road rage incident, and a stranger had actually yelled out "bloody Asians" to the Gonzales family when they were all traveling home in the car together from Claudine's 18th birthday dinner celebrations. The possibility that this could have been a racially motivated hate crime was quite high because authorities actually found at the the crime scene that a wall covering had been torn off the wall and replaced with a large blue spray painted message that said "fuck off Asians." It looked as though it could have been a robbery potentially. Teddy Gonzales's briefcase looked as though it had been gone through. There was, papers and things all around it. Things looked like it had been dropped out. There was lots of wardrobe doors open, suggesting that the intruder may have been rummaging through their things. The phone line had also been cut, which is why no one could get through when they were trying to call. The dogs were all found behind a closed door, unharmed, so this is why Emily could not hear them barking when her and her son were knocking at the door earlier that day. Now, when investigators were investigating this crime scene, they were investigating the robbery theory, and they soon came to realize that if this was a robbery, it was not a very good one. The house still seemed in pretty good condition. It was usually always very neat and clean, and it still seemed this way. There was just some papers sort of scattered around, but nothing in regards to what you would think a robber would do to a house if they were ransacking it. You would think it would be completely ransacked and things would be moved everywhere, but this just didn't seem like the case. There was $700 cash in Teddy's wallet, $300 cash in Loiva's handbag, there was electronics, expensive jewelry, and all this was untouched, which is bizarre. If it was a robbery, you would think they would have definitely found that and taken it. The wardrobe doors were open, but upon closer inspection, it actually looked as though nothing had been taken. Nothing had been pulled out, like you would think a robber would be doing if they're rummaging through everything. There would be stuff everywhere, drawers open. The blood spatters downstairs were actually analysed, and I don't exactly know the science behind it or how they know, but it's something to do with the way the blood spatters have fallen, and they could tell that the documents and papers that had appeared to be rummaged through and fallen mid-rummaging, they'd actually come back and tested the blood, and they could tell that these documents and papers had actually been placed there. They had not fallen mid-scuffle. So now investigators were a little bit sus because they could see that this was not a robbery, it was staged to look like a robbery, so who and why? More evidence that corroborates with this theory is that the flywire had actually been slashed and taken off and put on the ground outside on the grass, which is showing where the robber had come through and gained entry. However, on the window itself, it didn't even show any prying marks or that the flywire had been ripped off like in urgency. If you would be as a robber, you would be slashing it and ripping it off. You'd probably see some pry marks on the actual window itself, and there wasn't anything. So it looked like they had taken the time to take off the flywire or had done it prior. Also, there were no shoe or footprints on the kitchen counter underneath the window that the perpetrator had supposedly come through, and there would have had to have been some prints left on there because there was no way they could have come through the window without stepping on the counter underneath. So they obviously didn't come through the window. It was just staged to look like they had broken in through the window. Investigators also found fresh water on the shower tiles in the bathroom, which indicated that someone had recently taken a shower, and they could tell that this shower and the water hadn't been run until after the victims had died, if their calculations were correct. So it must have been the killer that took a shower. Doesn't really make sense that they would take a shower. Like, usually if it was a robbery, they would grab the things and run out of there as fast as possible so they can't get caught. They're not going to stick around and take a shower. It was also found that 2 large kitchen knives were missing from the Gonzales household, and one of them actually fit with the stab marks found on the victims. This was another red flag to authorities, because if someone had taken the time to premeditate this murder and lay in wait for several people and kill several people, I'm sure they would have brought their own weapon. They wouldn't have entered the home unarmed. There were bloody footprints found throughout the house, but these prints did not match anyone that had been in and out of the house. whether that be the victims, the police and authorities, the medics, the neighbours, or Seth. It just didn't match anyone. The prints were then identified to be a UK size 7 laceless human brand running shoe, and they definitely thought it was worn by the killer. Police dogs were brought to the scene but were unable to be of any assistance in this case, so police went around to the neighbours to ask them if they had heard anything that night and could be of any assistance. However, everyone said that they didn't hear anything, and this could have been to the really, really bad weather that Sydney was having that day and night. There was winds, raining, thunder. It was just a really loud storm, so all this noise could have just been, I guess, drowned out over the weather. So police again took Seth back to the police station to take more statements from him and to retrace the steps that he had taken that day, because again, he was the only one alive out of his family and he was the one that found them. So Seth again told the police about his day and that he had been at uni, then working at his father's law firm in the afternoon, and then he went to meet up with his mate Sam, but Sam had actually postponed their dinner plans, so Seth ended up driving home instead. Seth said that he got home at around 6 p.m. and he thought no one was home because the house was really quiet and really dark. So again, he assumed no one was home, and the weather was really terrible. It was raining, so he didn't really want to get out of the car and get wet. As he was sitting in the car, Seth received a phone call from his mate Sam, and Sam said that he was all good to go for 8 p.m. So Seth had 2 hours to kill, and he said that he just went off driving to fill in 2 hours. Seth ended up driving towards Kings Grove, which is actually where one of his friends had just recently moved to. So he was planning to go to his house and see him, and Kings Grove was about 22 kilometers south of North Ryde. So when Seth got to Kings Grove, he realized he didn't have the address of this friend that had recently moved there. Weird. So he just drove around until he had to go pick up his mate Sam. Finally, the time rolled around. He went and picked up his friend Sam. They dined at the Planet Hollywood for dinner, and they went to the arcade next door to play video games and spend some time there. And CCTV does prove that they were there doing this at this time. After all this, Seth dropped Sam home and then continued on his own way home and parked his green Ford Festiva in the driveway. Upon entering the house, he found his father dead and mistook the stab wounds for bullet holes. He then proceeded to call 000 and found the bodies of his mother and sister also in the house. When Seth was tending to his sister upstairs, he could hear some noises coming from downstairs, and he thought that he heard the side gate shut. So he ran out of the house to see who it was, and caught a glimpse of a figure running away from their house, which he assumed was the perpetrator, and he thought that it was a male, but he couldn't be 100% sure. He also said he thought he saw a second perpetrator running away, however he also couldn't be 100% sure of this. So 3 days after the murder of his own father, mother and sister, Seth Gonzales fronted the media and offered up a $100,000 reward for anyone that had any more information that could help solve this case or find the family killer. Seth stated, quote, "If you were to picture the four corners of the world, in my world, we were the four. The three corners of my world are now gone. My family, friends, and myself would like to ask anyone out there, please help us." Later that same day, Seth actually went to his father's accountant and asked for information about how he could access his inheritance. Obviously, we know that Teddy and Loiva had their big property that they had built on their land in North Ryde. They had 2 cars, and the contents inside their home also added up to substantial figures. There was expensive jewelry, general savings, and Teddy had commercial properties as investments in the Philippines as well. So the whole Gonzales estate in Australia ended up being worth around $1.5 million, and Teddy's investment properties in the Philippines ended up being around $1.3 million. Because Teddy, Loiva, and Claudine Gonzales were all now deceased, 20-year-old Seth Gonzales was now the sole beneficiary of his family's multi-million-dollar fortune. So guys, I'm actually going to leave this case here for now. This was part 1 of the Gonzales family murders, so make sure you tune into part 2 of the Gonzales family murders, which will be up in a couple of days' time. Be sure to turn on the notification bell and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on part 2 or any of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!